But you know, I've been protesting the growth of government for a number of years. I've had a concern lest the permanent structure of government becomes so big that it would become beyond the control of Congress and beyond the will of the people. And I have believed that this is a problem that crosses party lines. I've seen an interesting development down through the years. When I first suggested the danger of government control inherent in so many federal handouts, there were people who denied vehemently that any such thing could ever take place. And yet, before too long, the same people were saying, what's wrong with government control? And in the recent days, we've heard representatives in the higher echelons of government ask us, well, are you afraid of your own government? Well, to tell you the truth, I am. And all of us should be. And I speak not in a partisan sense of an administration or individuals. I'm talking of the institution of government. Wasn't this the admonition of the Founding Fathers, that government tends to grow, to take on power, until freedom eventually is lost? The fact is, and we can't escape it, only government is capable of tyranny. Now, I realize this is a controversial subject, particularly as we approach an election year. But then if you didn't take up things that were controversial, you'd never talk at all. There was a man knocked on a door one day, and a small boy answered, and the man said, son, is your father home? And the boy said, no. He said, is your mother home? And the boy said, no. And finally he said, well, son, I'm your uncle on your father's side. And the kid said, well, I guess you can come in, but I'll tell you right now, you're on the wrong side. In 1772, the Boston Committee of Correspondence proclaimed the right to life, liberty, and property. 2 years later, in Philadelphia, the First Continental Congress declared that Americans were entitled to life, liberty, and property. In June of 1776, the Virginia Bill of Rights asserted that all men were equally free and independent, with the means of possessing and the right to possess and acquire property. And 3 weeks later came the Declaration of Independence, a bloody war, victory, and then a new nation which would be based on a Constitution and a Bill of Rights. Life, liberty, and property had become life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And 70 years would go by before England's Lord Acton would comment on the task of these men and what they had accomplished with this document. He would say they had solved two problems which had heretofore baffled the most enlightened nations. They had prodigiously increased the power of the national government and had founded it on the principle of equality without surrendering the security for freedom and property. And it's true. Our Constitution is a contract guaranteeing the most limited and equitable government in the long history of man's relation to man. Now, however, while the national power is prodigious, what has happened to security for freedom and our right to the ownership of the fruit of our toil? The French philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville 100 years ago said the end of freedom comes when the party in power learns it can perpetuate itself through taxation. Well, what does happen to freedom when the executive branch of government can use the money taken from the people in order to coerce the people? A foolish fear? Representative Glenn Andrews introduced an amendment to the poverty program on the floor of Congress. It is almost inconceivable that such an amendment would be required. It is even more inconceivable that the amendment was overwhelmingly repudiated and defeated. It was a simple amendment that would prohibit poverty funds from being used for political purposes. Make no mistake about it. The party in power has legislated into existence a $1.8 billion campaign fund for 1966. Five years ago, we reached a new frontier, and now we're face to face with a great society, and along the way, we've added $31 billion to our debt, but we've decreased our gold holdings until concern is felt for the solvency of our currency. And very shortly, the coins we jingle in our pocket will no longer have the ring of silver. But have no fear. We reached something of the height of absurdity when in a press conference recently we were told that the government would stand behind those artificial coins and was prepared to exchange them anytime for paper. We've discovered that every family with an income of less than $3,000 a year is poverty-stricken. At the same time, we learn that the cost of government prorates out to $3,300 per family. We reach an all-time high in food prices, as every housewife here knows. But the farmer who produces that food receives the lowest percentage of the market basket dollar he's ever received in history. And his debt in relation to income is at an all-time high, higher even than on the eve of the 1929 crash. 4.5 years ago, 5 years ago, there were no daily casualty lists. No wives and mothers receiving telegrams that began, "We regret to inform you." The last campaign found our opponents presenting themselves as conservatives in the sense that they would make no drastic change in our easy, prosperous, and affluent way. They would maintain the status quo. That's Latin for the mess we're in. We, on the other hand, were presented as radicals who'd bring about some cataclysmic upheaval. Well, now the wraps are off the Great Society, and a multitude of messages and legislation has made it plain we're to have the welfare state with an unprecedented federalization of American life. June 30th last, Congress raised the debt limit for the 7th time in 5 years, but our government spends $260 million a day, $10 million more each day than we were spending just a year ago. We're told that we're enjoying an unprecedented prosperity, but 42 government agencies, the government has just informed us, are spending $70 billion a year on public welfare. And serious discussion is given by men in high place in government to the idea that there is no longer any necessity to connect work with income, and that a man simply by being born should be assured of an annual income with no need to work. The ancient Hebrew book, the Talmud, tells us that for a father to fail to teach his son to earn a living is the same as teaching him to steal, for that might be the inevitable result. Our limited government with its decentralized powers has given way to planners, and they've laid an increasingly heavy hand on every facet of our lives. To quote de Tocqueville again, he warned that such a government would cover the face of society with a network of small, complicated rules, minute and uniform, and thus the will of man is not shattered, but softened and guided until the nation is reduced to a flock of timid and industrious animals, of which government is the shepherd. Well, the shepherd, the president, is fond of quoting in these days from the scriptures. His favorite seems to be 1 Isaiah, the 18th verse. "Come, let us reason together." Now that has a sort of a warm and cozy sound, doesn't it? But let your eyes stray down a line or two into the next verses, the lines that are not quoted aloud. "If ye refuse, ye shall be devoured with the sword."